My name is Gladys Hawthorne. I'm 67 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I was somebody's wife for 42 years. Now I'm just a widow with a name on a mailbox and too many casseroles in the freezer. Walter passed in his sleep. The doctor called it peaceful, but grief doesn't follow medical definitions. It comes in quiet waves, in half-filled coffee mugs, in the echo of a chair sliding back with no one in it. That morning, the snow was already knee-deep on the porch steps. Vermont doesn't go easy in January, but the cold had never bothered me like this before. I sat by the front window in my thick cardigan holding a mug I hadn't sipped from in over an hour. The clock on the wall ticked loud, but the house felt heavier than the silence. I thought about starting the laundry, or opening the sympathy cards that kept piling up. But instead, I just sat there staring at the woods beyond the fence line. Walter used to joke that the pine trees were the only things he trusted to stay put. He wasn't wrong. At 8:15 a.m., the phone buzzed on the table. I didn't even need to check the screen. I knew it was Nathan. My only child, my late-in-life miracle, now grown and busy and living 3 towns over. He didn't call often, which meant this wasn't just about checking in. He started with small talk, asking if the heat was working and if I needed salt for the walkway. I gave him short answers. Then he eased into the real reason. He and Julie had been talking. About me. About the house. About how it might be too much for me to handle alone now. He said it kindly as if it were a gift. He said they had a room ready. The guest room. The twins could keep sharing. It would be nice to have me closer, he added. Easier for everyone. I didn't respond. I just listened. Then came the part that made my fingers tighten around the mug. He mentioned the roof, the market, the rising interest rates. Julie's coworker had a buyer already lined up. He said I didn't have to worry. They'd handle everything. The paperwork, the closing, the move. All I had to do was say yes. I told him I'd think about it. That seemed to satisfy him. We hung up and I sat there a little longer until the coffee turned cold and the trees outside began to blur. That afternoon, I went into Walter's study for the first time since the funeral. I hadn't been ready before. His coat still hung by the door. The desk was neat, just like he'd left it. I opened the center drawer slowly. There were the usual things: pens, receipts, bank statements, and then tucked behind an old checkbook, an envelope. My name written in his handwriting. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a folded deed notarized and dated 6 months ago. I read the location once, then again. Interlaken, Switzerland. My breath caught in my chest. There was no letter, just the deed, just the truth. A house I didn't know existed. A house he had bought for us. Or maybe just for me. I stood in that study as the light began to dim outside. The radiator clicked on, sending warm air into the room. But it wasn't the heater that made something stir inside me. It was the knowing. Quiet, heavy, and undeniable. Walter had given me something I didn't know I needed. A place. A choice. And maybe a way out. Raising Nathan was the greatest commitment of my life. I gave up a teaching career I loved to stay home when his asthma turned severe during his toddler years. I learned to stretch every dollar-cut coupons and make Christmas magical, even when Walter's paycheck barely covered groceries. I don't say that for pity. I say it because when a child grows up with that kind of love, you don't expect to be converted into an inconvenience. Nathan was the boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunder scared him. He was the one I stayed up with through fevers, heartbreaks, and college application panic. I used to know every shade of his face when he needed comfort. Lately, I can barely recognize the man who only calls when there's a plan. The plan came into full view that Saturday afternoon. Julie had made lasagna. It sat untouched in front of me as she handed over a folder of papers. Nathan smiled the way people do when they're about to tell you something they know you won't like, but want to pretend you will. He said they had spoken to a real estate agent. He used words like market timing and inventory shortages, and said this was the perfect moment to list my house. I asked them if this was really about my well-being. Julie said of course it was. Then she mentioned that the twins needed more room, that the school district near them was better, that living closer would be good for me too. She had printed brochures of the assisted living cottages down the road from their new place. I nodded and flipped through the folder slowly. Nathan said they had already found a buyer, a young couple expecting their first child. They wanted to move in quickly. He said it like it was good news. I looked at him, the same boy who once refused to go to sleep unless I sang him the lullaby about the moon. Now he was calculating square footage and resale values. He was solving a problem. The problem was me. Julie pulled out a pen. Nathan said all I had to do was sign to get things started. I smiled politely and told them I'd need to think. Julie blinked. Nathan's smile faltered. I kept my face calm and my voice pleasant. I reached for my water glass to steady my hands. They didn't need to know how hard it was to keep them from shaking. What they did not know and would not know yet was that I had already seen a different future, one with mountains and still water, one that Walter left tucked behind a drawer, quiet as a secret. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. Not yet. We sat in that dining room another half hour. They spoke of logistics, movers, storage units. I nodded as if I were already packing. They didn't see the silence forming inside me like a new kind of strength. After I left, Nathan walked me to my car. He kissed my cheek and said we'd talk soon. I watched his face trying to find the boy I raised. He was buried somewhere, but I could no longer reach him. As I pulled out of their driveway, the folder of property documents sat heavy in my bag. Not theirs. Mine. A quiet anchor I wasn't ready to throw, but one I knew would hold. The house might be big and lonely, but it was mine. And so was the choice. The house felt colder than usual when I stepped back inside. Maybe it was the wind sneaking through the door behind me, or maybe it was the silence that came after being spoken to like a burden. I left my coat on, walked into the study, and sat in Walter's chair like I used to when he was out fishing. The drawer stuck slightly as I pulled it open. I had found the envelope earlier that week but hadn't touched it. I wasn't ready. Now I was. My name was written across the front in Walter's handwriting, steady and square. Inside, folded neatly, was a letter dated 6 weeks before his heart gave out. I held it for a moment before reading the weight of the paper heavier than it should have been. He wrote that if I was reading this, then he was gone, and I was facing everything without him. He said he had worried about that for years. Not because I was incapable, but because I was too willing to make myself small for other people's comfort. He said the world often forgets what women like me have carried, and how long we've carried it. He told me about the house, in Interlaken, on a quiet street near a lake with bright green water. He said he bought it in secret, not because he didn't trust me, but because he didn't trust the noise that would follow if anyone else knew. He wrote that he wanted to leave me something untouched, a place with no memories except the ones I chose to make. He said I deserved that. Not just a new start, but the space to decide whether I wanted one. He said I had spent my whole life choosing what was best for others. Now, it was my turn. He added one more thing, a line I read 3 times before setting the page down. Be careful with Nathan. He has a good heart, but sometimes fear makes people act like they don't. If he pushes, don't let it be the reason you fold. I sat there a long time, the letter open in my lap, the light from the desk lamp pooling across the words like they were still being written. Walter had seen it coming. Not just his death, but everything that would come after. And he had left me the only thing I didn't know I needed. Permission. Not to run, not to hide, but to choose. For myself. I told Nathan I'd thought about it. That's all I had to say. He sighed like someone who had just won a quiet argument and said he'd bring the papers next Saturday. I said I'd be home. He didn't ask if I was sleeping well or how I was feeling, only mentioned the buyer was ready to close. The next morning, I walked through each room of the house. I touched the handrails Walter polished every fall, ran my fingers along the windowsill where Emma once drew hearts in the condensation. Then I opened the hall closet and started packing. Not for a move across town, for a crossing of my own. Each item I touched had a memory, but I didn't cry. I wrapped Nathan's old baseball glove in tissue paper and boxed it carefully. I labeled the outside. For Nathan. Keep what you still remember. Julie's pine cone ornament went in a separate box. The ones she once called ugly but cried over when it broke, and I fixed it with gold glue. Each box had a destination. None were coming with me. On Tuesday, the movers arrived. Lou was kind and didn't ask many questions. I told him to be careful with the small chest in the study. He nodded and carried it like it was glass. By Thursday, the house was almost bare. But I left one thing in the living room placed neatly on the console table. A white envelope. Inside was a small card. On Friday night, I laid out my red wool coat, the one Walter bought me on our 30th anniversary. It still fit. It felt like armor. In the small purse by the door, I had packed my passport, the key, and the letter. At 9:15 a.m. Saturday morning, Nathan pulled into the driveway. He stepped out holding coffee and a folder. He didn't notice the moving truck until he reached the porch. Then his smile dropped. He walked in without knocking. The first thing he saw wasn't me. It was the envelope on the table. He opened it and stood frozen for a moment. Then read the card aloud under his breath. I raised you to build, not to evict. He turned toward me. What is this? What's going on? I told him I was moving. He looked at the half-empty walls. You weren't supposed to do this. Mom, we had a plan. No, I said. You had a plan. I had one too. He stepped closer, voice tightening. Where are you going? Somewhere that doesn't need a committee vote. His hands opened, searching for something to grip. He said the buyers were expecting a signature today, that people had rearranged things. I nodded. That's their problem now. You're being unreasonable, he said, impulsive. I smiled, but only with my mouth. Grief didn't make me rash. It made me clear, crystal clear. He stared at me, hurt blooming in the corners of his eyes. It was the first real thing I'd seen on his face in months. Then he said something that almost landed. You could have told me. I didn't respond. Some truths don't come with announcements. Lou stepped inside to let me know the truck was ready. I thanked him, handed him a tip, and picked up my suitcase. Nathan didn't move. The envelope was still in his hand, but his grip had loosened. The car service pulled up at the curb. The driver opened the door. I paused before stepping in and looked back once. Not at the house, at my son. He looked smaller than I remembered. A boy in a man's shoes, still trying to manage something that was never his to own. I didn't say goodbye. At the airport, the process was smooth. Zurich, then Bern, then the final train to Interlaken. I carried no map, only a key. By the time we boarded, the sky outside the terminal had turned soft with cloud. I touched the brass in my pocket. Walter's last gesture. Not a gift. A door. And I had chosen to walk through it. The house in Interlaken sat at the edge of a quiet lane with shutters painted the color of lake water and ivy curling along the stone walls. In the morning, the bells from the village church chimed softly, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and fresh bread. The mountains held the sky in place, and the lake below mirrored it back like a promise. I filled the room slowly, not with furniture, but with breath. I opened windows, let the light settle on floors that had never known me. There was no history here, and somehow that felt like freedom. No casserole dishes waiting to be returned. No envelopes with return addresses I couldn't face. Just time stretching wide and slow like a field after snowfall. I was slicing an apple one afternoon when the phone rang. It was just past 2:15 p.m. The voice on the other end trembled, then steadied. It was Emma. She said she had seen the shipping label on the box I sent to her parents' house. Interlaken. She had Googled it, then cried, then called. She asked if she could come. When she arrived 2 days later, I met her at the train station. She was thinner than I remembered, with a worried look in her eyes that reminded me of Nathan when he first started school. She hugged me too tightly, then stepped back like she thought she'd done something wrong. I told her I was glad she was here. That evening, we sat on the small terrace and watched the sun drop behind the peaks. Emma told me that her parents had fallen on hard times after Nathan's investment firm folded. He had kept it quiet, too proud to admit the scale of the loss. She said he wasn't cruel, just scared. He had convinced himself that selling my house was the only way to protect everyone. I listened without interrupting. My fingers curled around the teacup, warm and steady. I didn't excuse him, but I understood something new. Nathan wasn't trying to erase me. He was drowning in his own fear, and like many men raised to never ask for help, he had chosen control over honesty. Understanding is not the same as forgiving, but it is a beginning. It softens the air between two mountains. It opens the window, even if just a little. That night, I placed Walter's letter back in the drawer and left the curtains open. The stars over Interlaken didn't need to be hidden. Neither did I. The sun was low over the lake, casting gold across the tiled rooftops below. I sat on the balcony with a pen in hand and a new journal resting on my lap. On the first page, I wrote the words that had taken me a lifetime to find. This time, I didn't disappear. I finally arrived for myself. Inside, Emma moved softly through the kitchen, her quiet presence a comfort I didn't know I still needed. The breeze carried the sound of church bells up the hill. I closed the journal, leaned back in the chair, and let peace settle where fear used to live.